I think this is a very sad development. President Trump is the leader of NATO. If President Trump were sincerely interested in building peace in Eastern Europe, if he was interested, as I thought he was, in normalizing relations with Russia, then he would intervene to stop this. He could simply say, look, I don't agree with this, and as the leader of NATO, I'm saying stop. And if he said that to Merz would shut up and stop. But he hasn't done that. He's essentially failed miserably in his leadership of NATO as well as in leadership of the United States. He's not even capable of pursuing what's in our own interest anymore. He's incoherent. He contradicts himself. If you listen to Trump now and compare him with Trump of just 60 days ago or 90 days ago, you're dealing with entirely different people. He makes these outrageous statements about the Russians killing lots of people. Well, what does he think happens in a war, especially when the enemy begins to fall apart as the Ukrainians have? They begin to take very heavy casualties as the Russians move forward. Again, where is he in all of this? Could he play a role? Yes, he could have played a role. Now he's irrelevant.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on that in just a second here, but I want to stick first of all on the Russian side here, because just a few days ago, Sergei Lavrov was at a conference, and he was on the stage. He was given a speech and was asked a really important question here, and his answer really took me by surprise, because from the time that Trump was inaugurated and he was making these overtures to Russia, the officials in Russia were making really politic, diplomatic, and evasive statements. See, they said they want the war to end, they want a peace, they would consider a ceasefire, all these kind of things, but they were kind of mum on what they would do. Now then, they're getting more prescriptive and direct. Here is Sergei Lavrov just a couple of days ago talking about however this thing ends, whether a negotiated settlement or a military, there is one thing they will not tolerate inside of Kiev.
Мы не можем оставить людей под властью того режима, который сейчас там находится. И если правительство, так называемое, хунта, по большому счету, Зеленского, если они рассчитывают на то, что каким-то образом будет достигнута договоренность о прекращении боевых действий, и то, что останется от Украины, будет жить по тем законам, которые они напринимали, это иллюзия. Этого допустить нельзя ни в коем случае.
For anybody who may not have been able to read that small print on there, what he said was anybody who thinks that this war is going to end under any circumstances that's going to allow the Zelensky regime and the laws that he has on there to remain in power is a complete illusion. Under no circumstances will he allow that, he said at the end. What is your reaction?
From the very beginning, President Putin has said repeatedly, we want to get at the root causes of the war. And we want to talk about solving the problems that are the root causes of this conflict. We've ignored that repeatedly. We said, oh, no, let's have a ceasefire. Let's have a ceasefire. Then we'll talk. And the point has been made over and over and over again. We're not going to agree to a ceasefire with a regime that we know will essentially utilize the ceasefire for the purpose of rebuilding its military power with the goal of ultimately keeping the war going indefinitely. Well, that was part of it. But now he's gone one step further. He's made it very clear that we're not going to leave this regime in place, because if we do, we know the regime will restart the war. And he's 100% right. Anything Zelensky says is a lie. He'll lie to say whatever he has to survive and maintain power. And then he's betting on the support of people like Merz, who are, in my judgment, fools, to provide him with weapons and money to continue his war. I don't think we understand that. How do you get at the root problem? You get at the root problem by making it clear that the regime has to go away. There needs to be a new government that is dedicated to essentially peaceful relations with its neighbors. In other words, we're not going to fight a war and then leave the Hitlerian government in power in 1945. I mean, we could have stopped at the Rhine. The Soviets could have stopped much earlier. They could have stopped along the Vistula. But what would that have done? That would have left the problem in place. The problem had to be removed. And there was great hope at the time that someone inside Germany would remove Hitler and put the Nazis out of business. That didn't happen. It hasn't happened in Ukraine. So from his standpoint, and I think this is completely justified, the regime has to change. We refuse to change it. And this is a mystery to the Russians because in their view, President Trump has the power and the influence to do so. But I think we're discovering that the CIA and their friends on the Hill and the Senate and the House, these people are far more powerful than President Trump. And so I think they've essentially written off Trump as a nice guy. We like him, but he can't accomplish anything.
Yeah, and that is part of the problem. We're going to see how that manifests a little bit more in a second. But I want to one more thing on the Russian side here. I want to take a look at what Putin. So that's Lavrov's talking about politically what's going to be left regime-wise. But then in terms of the means to get there, I think Putin laid out a pretty strong case the other day that this war is about to get even more dire for the Ukraine side when he's going to open up what's effectively a northern front. He said here in this clip that he's going to have a buffer zone in the north, but when you take a look at this in a map, which you'll do in a second, you'll see that this is really just opening up a new front. Here's what Putin said.
Речь идет и о Курской области, и о Брянской, и о Белгородской областях, которые также пострадали и подвергаются обстрелам. Причем цели противник выбирает, как правило, не имеющие военного значения. Мирные объекты, дома, людей. И события сегодняшнего дня только подтверждают то, что мною было только что сказано. При налетах дронов, действиях диверсионно-разведывательных групп охотятся за гражданским транспортом, включая автомобили скорой помощи, сельхозтехнику. Гибнут и получают ранения и женщины, и дети. Уже говорил, что было принято решение о создании необходимой буферной зоны безопасности вдоль границ.
And Gary, if you can toss that map up there, this is what that buffer zone is going to look like. This in the group of north, it's about 100 kilometers in. It's not just like some of these that they're currently doing in Sumy in the north or in the Kharkiv area just north of the city, where it's a small little area here, like 10, 15 kilometers. This one is 100 kilometers in depth and goes across the breadth of the north. And in combination with what they're already doing on the entire Eastern Front, I mean, you're talking about a pretty substantial chunk of the Ukrainian forces, a country, and I don't think they have the force to do this. What does this tell you?
Well, the buffer zone that was discussed shortly before President Putin made his announcement said that the buffer zone will cover Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Chernihiv, Kharkov, and Sumy regions. This was according to someone named Zobolev at the State Duma Defense Committee. And the Western media wrote that Russia's coming offensive after breaking through the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces will create such a zone and also capture additional territory. If I were a Russian, this is what I would do. You and I have talked about this repeatedly, and I have always pointed to the Dnieper River. Why would you not insist on the removal of all elements threatening your country, your citizens, their weapon systems, and their people from the east side of the Dnieper? Why would you leave anything there? It's a rational decision, in my estimate. And again, this all happens in the aftermath of President Trump's incoherent statements, where he does a 180-degree turn. He's no longer talking about the Russians as negotiating partners and are coming to some sort of arrangement with Russia to do business. Now he's suddenly talking about, they're bloodthirsty and they're killing people. Well, you kill people in wars. There's not much choice in the matter if you're a Russian. If you don't kill them, they're going to kill you. And I think this is all evidence for the decision that's been made in Moscow. We're going to end this war on our terms. We're not going to bet on the goodwill or sincerity of anybody in the West because there is none.
And in terms of what Russia may be doing militarily, that was Putin talking about this this so-called buffer zone. But there are some Western publications, and actually Zelensky's been saying this himself a little bit. Here's RUSI talking about a summer offensive, and one of the big important things, and this is bigger than I think a lot of people recognize, in this they wrote, not just is an offensive coming, but Ukraine has suffered throughout this period from a shortage of troops, with recruitment still far below the level needed to maintain the force. But Russia's ability to inflict casualties on the armed forces of Ukraine was not matched by an ability to take ground. We'll talk about that in a second. But then the key part, Russian recruitment, however, has exceeded Kremlin targets for every month of 2025. Having shuffled commanders and built up reserves of equipment, Russia now is set to increase the tempo and scale of attacks. So if the Ukraine side already has a dearth of troops, they can't offset losses, and the Russians are exceeding their recruitment. I mean, what does this tell you about where the war is going on the battlefield?
Well, I think it's obvious the war is won by the Russians, has been won for quite a while, but now the unwillingness of the West to negotiate an end in good faith leaves the Russians no choice but to press the attack. They don't have any choice in the matter. What else can they do? And I think they're going to end this war probably in control of Kharkov as well as Odessa. They haven't crossed the river yet, but I think they're going to have to, because Odessa is the principal port from which Ukraine has drawn much of its weaponry and munitions and so forth. Right now, the Russians are well aware that the Polish government has about had it with Ukrainians. The 3 million plus Ukrainians living in Poland are being asked to go home. The Poles can't afford to keep them there anymore. And the Poles don't want anything to do with Russia's war against Ukraine. They don't want to oppose the Russians. They've lost several thousand Polish troops. The Russians know these things. The people who are doing all the talking and posturing are people like Merz and Macron, Starmer, and sadly Trump, people that have no skin in the game. And they know that. So they're going to ignore it all and move further west until they feel they've secured their country. I don't know why anybody is surprised by any of this. If you fail to talk to people, and we have resisted simply sitting down and talking to people, and not just talking to them, but listening to them. We have never listened to the Russians, because the people behind the scenes that elected Donald Trump and put him into the White House are the same people who are covering for Netanyahu's mass murder and expulsion of people from both Gaza and ultimately the West Bank. They want this to continue. And apparently they're in control, not Donald Trump. Can't just view what's happening in Ukraine in isolation of what's happening in Western Europe. Prime Minister of Great Britain is in a lot of trouble. He's clinging very precariously to power right now. The population, let's face it, is practically in rebellion against a government and a state that is determined to destroy them in favor of recently arrived immigrants who, frankly, aren't British, don't want to be British, will never be British. And that's not going to work very well. The situation in France is at least as bad, in some ways worse. Both Britain and France are practically insolvent. I don't see how they're going to sustain themselves too much longer financially. And then you're bringing in people like Tusk from Poland. Tusk is a globalist, just like Macron and Starmer. And then, of course, von der Leyen is absolutely indistinguishable from Klaus Schwab or Larry Fink. These are the people that want the giant surveillance state to make sure that you and I express the right opinions. And anybody that raises objections to what any of these globalists want to do inside our countries is deemed to be an extremist. And any form of speech that deviates from their wishes is extreme speech and has to be suppressed. So let's look at the catastrophic conditions, in my judgment, that you have in Europe. Now, the people that are responsible for these catastrophic decisions or conditions and are ultimately going to be removed by them are the ones that are saying, well, we have to go forward and win the war in Ukraine, which is not just a contradiction, it's absurd. There is no chance whatsoever for this Ukrainian regime in Kiev to field any sort of force that is capable of defeating the Russians. And the Russians have made their case. They have tried to outline their legitimate security interests, and at every turn they've been rejected. We just don't listen to them. Trump went to Alaska and apparently either didn't understand what he was being told or just decided he didn't like it. So the other thing that's happening, in addition to the slow sort of disintegration of the West European governments that I mentioned, is that the world is dividing into two hemispheres. Now, one hemisphere, which is the hemisphere you and I live in, plus Europe, seems to be determined, and I'm talking largely about North America, seems to be determined to live in isolation from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has said, fine, we'll live in isolation from you. We'll build our own parallel institutions, our own alternative to the SWIFT system, which the Chinese have created and to all reports seems to work better than our own. And by the way, our money is going to be meaningful because it's going to be backed by gold and potentially other commodities. In the meantime, we're sitting here on a ticking time bomb, a $9 trillion bill that has to be paid off at the end of the year or we face default. This is interest on our wonderful sovereign national debt that we can't retire. So this division into two worlds is probably now unavoidable and permanent. So we're not really talking to the people on the other side. We're not talking to China. We're not talking to Beijing or Moscow. We're not talking to anybody in Tehran. We're not talking to anybody in Delhi anymore. We're talking to ourselves. And we're quite convinced that we're right, everyone else is wrong, and everyone else should do what we tell them to do. It's almost Kafkaesque.
Yeah, and definitely frustrating-ish. No question about that, because these trends you're talking about are not hard to see, at least for people willing to just look at things as they are. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of willingness at the leader level to see things as they are. And let's first of all take a look at this. This is what President Trump said after the meeting that they just held here, according to The Hill. It says President Trump emphasized that Europe must stop purchasing Russian oil that is funding the war, as Russia receives over $1 billion in fuel sales from the EU in 1 year, a White House statement said. The president also emphasized that European leaders must place economic pressure on China for funding war efforts. And Doug, I mean, I just got to say that those are both nearly impossible tasks. There's a reason why the Europeans haven't stopped buying Russian oil so far, even though all during this war. And there's especially in light of the SCO meeting and of China's big celebration in Beijing yesterday, there is zero chance that you're going to successfully pressure China into doing anything against Russia. What do you make of these kinds of statements coming out of the White House?
Well, this is unfortunately consistent, not just with President Trump and everything he's been saying and doing, but frankly, everything that his predecessor said and did. At every turn, our answer to the Russians, and whenever they expressed their views on anything, whenever they tried to explain their legitimate national security interests, whenever they talked about a new security architecture, one in which Russian security, German security, anyone's security in Europe would not be purchased at the expense of anyone else. And what did we answer? We answered with escalation. We've continued to provide the Ukrainians with the means to attack Russia on Russian soil. We have been behind or had our hands in all of the quote unquote modest, successful strategic strikes that certainly garnered a great deal of attention, but did nothing to alter the course of the war. These are the drone strikes on the Russian strategic bombers, the most recent ones against the gasification refinery plants in Russia. None of these things were crippling in a strategic sense. None of these are altering the course of events. But they seem to create the illusion in the minds of the people that launched them that there's life in this regime in Kiev. In the meantime, as I think you pointed out some time ago, we just watched something in the neighborhood of 13,000 Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 25 leave the country, conveying the impression that the Ukrainian government has decided that if they don't let these people go, they too will be murdered on the battlefield, because there's no alternative to that right now. They're dealing with a military machine they cannot resist. And so perhaps it's prudent to let them leave in the hopes that at some point they can come back and repopulate Ukraine. I don't know. I'm speculating. But the whole picture is ridiculous. We continue down a path that has no chance of success, but it's doing a damn fine job of alienating the rest of the world. And that's what we saw in China over the last few days. And by the way, all that Chinese military might that was on display was not aimed at us. It was simply a clear and unambiguous signal that we cannot be bullied. You can't bully us into submission. You can't force us into any sort of arrangement that is not in our interest. And by the way, they haven't said anything or done anything to suggest that they want to harm us. We're the ones insisting that their success in any way, shape, or form is harming us. I mean, stop and consider this. Between $8 and $14 trillion since 2001 on all of these catastrophic military strategic failures. Just stop and think about that sum. The Chinese have invested perhaps $1 trillion in building up the infrastructure for the One Belt, One Road that basically is designed to connect everyone on the Eurasian continent and Africa back to China and vice versa. In other words, a new commercial structure beyond anything that was conceived of under the Mongolian Empire in terms of commercial ties between East and West. Something beyond anything we've seen, certainly since the end of the Second World War, that promises to create enormous prosperity all over Eurasia and potentially Africa in time. And we are treating that as catastrophic. Something has to be resisted. Something has to be broken because we are not in charge of it. It's not our idea. We didn't think of it. And we utterly refuse to be part of anything that we do not dominate. That's essentially what it comes down to. So Donald Trump, for all of his rhetoric about settling conflicts and promoting peace and prosperity, is in the same business as his predecessor, trying to cling to the impossible position of global military hegemony run from Washington.
And that's expired. The use by date has passed, and instead of recognizing that, we just keep going down a bad and fruitless path. That's also mirrored to a large extent in Europe. I'm going to get to a bit of that in a second, but let's first start with Zelensky, because he's kind of deepened and dug into his trench a little bit deeper. Here's what he had to say after talking with President Trump. This is on his X account here, if you can pop that one up there. Basically, he's one of the things that he said really all throughout this war, and took the opportunity again to say, he said, first and foremost, we talked about how to push the situation towards real peace. We discussed different options. The most important is pressure, using strong measures, particularly economic ones, to force an end to the war. The key to peace is driving Russia's war machine, or depriving it of money, depriving it of resources. And then he also adds, we also spoke about the maximum protection for Ukraine's skies. Until peace comes, Ukraine must not be at the mercy of constant Russian attacks. Russian missiles and drones must not take lives. Ukraine has proposed a format for protecting our skies for the U.S. to consider. So he wants some version of a air cover from the United States, and then instead of putting pressure on anyone else, he wants pressure on Russia alone, economics, which is ironic because President Trump announced right before this that he wanted to put pressure on Europe to stop buying Russian oil, and then also on China and presumably India, since he's got sanctions on them. But Zelensky's not even on the same page as Trump, because Trump didn't say anything about Russia so far. What do you think?
I think that Zelensky's prescription is global thermonuclear war launched by the United States against Russia. It's insane. It makes no sense. And my great fear is that there are people in Washington that don't understand that that is the inevitable outcome if we don't take the off-ramp and get off of this dead-end road that we're on with Zelensky, because that's what he wants. He just doesn't want Europe to support him. He wants us to make it impossible for Russia to defeat him or anyone else. Well, that's not going to happen. We have no interest in that. And I think that President Trump foolishly listens to this man, and obviously to people around him, who tell him that we are more powerful than we are, that we are in a position to dictate terms which we're not. And this man, Zelensky, is evidence for all of that kind of thinking. So the real question at this stage is, President Trump, what are you going to do to extricate the United States from this utterly pointless and fruitless policy that you inherited from President Biden? Thus far, his answer is nothing. I'm going to keep it up. I'm going to continue to do it. And if you really want to push this to the limits, you will end up in a nuclear exchange with Russia. The Russians have been very straightforward. We understand the conditions that they described. None of those are unacceptable, frankly, to us. We do not lose as a result of supporting neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. We don't lose with a government in Kiev that is at least not hostile, if not aligned with Moscow. We lose if we are dragged into a war over a part of the world that is of no strategic importance to us against Russia. That's how we lose. And what you saw again over in China was a group of people, what is it, more than 40% of the world's population, and probably at least half of its natural resources, mineral wealth, oil, gas, you name it. We saw a demonstration that they have all gotten together and said, we would like to have peace in our time with the United States, but we will not submit to Donald Trump's bullying tactics. So he's got to make a decision. Where does he want to take us? Further and further down the road to disaster and potential war? Or does he want to get off the train, go somewhere else in a new direction?